Thank you, thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm Thomas. I study the human-AI interface. My latest book is on that. There's a signed copy waiting for you somewhere. In fact, 351, I think, signed copies, which took about 35 minutes. So, and you know, sometimes you wish you could automate things and you have AI, but it's not always the case. So, human beings have a long and rich history of blaming their own technological inventions for their own cultural demise. Socrates and his fellow philosophers, think of them as the original hipsters, were opposed to the invention of writing on the grounds that it would ruin our memory. When modern newspapers were invented, critics lamented that they would kill social gatherings. Why meet, after all, if there's no news or gossip to exchange? And most notably, for about 100 years, we've been accusing all forms of mass media, from radio to television and video games and social media, of making us stupid. So it should really come as no surprise that the overall sentiment about AI is largely negative. Indeed, AI has been accused of destroying or killing jobs and creating a useless class of humans, making society biased, and making us, humans, antisocial. Now, to be fair, these claims are not totally off, but a little bit of nuance or rational moderation would be useful to understand their substance. So let's start with job destruction. Even though it is true that AI may make certain jobs obsolete, it mostly automates specific tasks within jobs, changing the constellation of skills required to perform them. So, for example, just like the Uber app makes it less important for taxi drivers to know their way around the city, but more important for them to have clean cars and an interesting conversation, so generative AI devalues certain hard skills like translating, copywriting, and coding, while increasing the value of tasks that still depends on human creativity and ingenuity, like prompt engineering. So at the same time, we know that just like with previous technological revolutions, even when AI eliminates entire jobs, it tends to create more new jobs and at a faster rate and with higher frequency, which is why unemployment rates have remained relatively low since the digital revolution and are trending downwards, but talent shortages are high. Now, people who are displaced from certain jobs don't automatically have access to the new jobs that are created, which is why reskilling and upskilling people, and reskilling yourself really, is the fundamental challenge of today. So, but just because humans are likely to remain employed doesn't mean they'll be more productive. And in fact, there's a lot of data on productivity. The data on this are very clear. Between 2000 and 2008, in the first phase of the digital revolution, productivity, defined as doing more with less, or output divided by input, went up, only to stagnate after 2008, when AI-fueled social media platforms became ubiquitous. So we know that between 60 and 85% of smartphone use occurs during working hours. That 70% of workers report to being distracted at work. In the US, this amounts to a productivity cost of $650 billion each year, which is about 15 times higher than the cost of sickness and absenteeism. And multitasking, which we all do, is a myth. It deducts the equivalent of 10 IQ points from your performance, which is about as debilitating as smoking weed, presumably minus the benefits, or less enjoyable. So the average, but you will know, or some people would know, the average human is expected to spend 20 years on screen time, of which 7 years are spent on social media. So in short, Our clients, colleagues, bosses, spouses, friends, children, and pets are competing for our attention, and AI is winning. In the early days of the pandemic, when offices shut and people were sent back to work from home, a client of mine remarked or wondered, without the office, how will I pretend to work? And it is true that there are fewer incentives for us to pretend to work when we are working from home, but at the same time, opportunities for distraction are much higher. In fact, the thought of having colleagues, analog colleagues in the real world, come to distract us with their updates or news or gossip might represent a welcoming distraction from our usual digital distractions today. So it seems like productivity can increase not just by using, but also ignoring technology wisely. As for the bias question, it is true that since AI is only as good as the data it ingests, and these data come from human preferences, choices, and behaviors, we shouldn't expect it to be very accurate. In fact, even generative AI, which goes to great lengths to mitigate bias, is probably as objective as the BBC. And that people on the left accuse it of being right, and people on the right accuse it of being woke, right? Maybe this is the highest possible bar or standards for objectivity in human affairs, to make everybody equally unhappy. And if you think about when guardrails are introduced to censor problematic or controversial content and really mitigate biases, we mostly mock generative AI for being blunt or lame, which tells you how much we love our biases, especially when we don't identify them as such, or when we identify as open-minded people, which tend to result in us hanging out with people who are exactly like us. So even if you look at examples of AI experiments that backfire, for instance, the famous case studies where companies try to use recruitment AI, for example, train a chatbot to predict who gets promoted in their culture organization, and the chatbot or AI recommends a surplus of middle-aged white male engineers. The bias is not in the AI, it's in the company culture, which is why if you don't use that chatbot, middle-aged white male engineers will probably still get promoted. Just like when Google search censors the autocomplete function that follows in completion of the sentence, women are, it doesn't really eliminate sexism from human society, only from its website. So we have to understand that, first of all, AI can never be biased in the same way humans are. Algorithms don't have a fragile self-esteem that they try to protect by bringing other people down and then feel better about themselves. And at the same time, that it will be very easy from a technical standpoint to tweak or edit AI to make us more open-minded. Think of it as open-minded AI as opposed to open AI. Right? So imagine if we edited or changed the recommendation engines that you have on Spotify, Netflix, Amazon, Twitter, Tinder, maybe even some job matching tools, in order to serve you or suggest things you don't like but should consider to broaden your horizons. This would probably lead to mass defection from these platforms onto tools that give us more of what we want and that turn us into an exaggerated version of ourselves. Which is why fact-checking tools that basically monitor presidential debates or prime ministerial debates never change voting intentions, or why in the infamous Cambridge Analytica study, the AI identified that only 15% of voters anywhere are deemed persuadable, meaning 85% are beyond persuasion, whether you target them with real news or fake news. In short, human beings have done a brilliant job at refining and perfecting their biases for millennia, without the help of technology, and AI is no exception. So we should take credit for our own biases. As for the statement or the assumption that AI is making us more antisocial, well, there's a little bit of truth in that. After all, most of the AI algorithms or tools that fuel social media reward selfish self-promotion or shameless self-promotion, inappropriate self-disclosure, and, well, narcissistic behavior. We probably wouldn't even have social media if we, as a species, hadn't been a little bit narcissistic to begin with. But it is also true that social media has normalized digital narcissism. So in the real world, if you go around your office telling everybody how great you are, not listening, talking all the time, seeming unjustifiably pleased with yourself and unaware of your limitations, and telling everybody what your cat had for breakfast, you probably would be deemed pretty annoying and obnoxious. But in the digital world, AI will turn you into an influencer. Now, narcissism has been increasing for about 50 years and at a higher rate than obesity, which is why, Paris Hilton seems very humble by Kim Kardashian standards, and why the next version of Kanye will probably make the current or real Kanye seem quite modest. Same for Andrew Tate, by the way, which I know is a scary, scary thought. Luckily for us, AI is not judgmental in the human sense. So, otherwise, you would expect AI or algorithms to wonder how a species so accomplished and advanced could be so insecure and desperately needy of validation. In fact, I think as generative AI resembles humans more and more, it often acts as an insecure narcissist. So somebody more confident than competent, not totally convinced of his grandiosity or its grandiosity, and happily mansplaining things, but desperately seeking validation and approval. So it seems to me that we oppose AI more the more AI resembles us. And that the lesson here is that if when we see ourselves reflected through the lens or the image of AI, we don't really like what we see, because AI is amplifying some of our dark side tendencies, we have a real opportunity to upgrade ourselves or improve to make the AI age the human AI age. And I think there are 3 clear opportunities or ways of doing this. The first is harnessing the skills and qualities that AI is unlikely to emulate. Things like empathy, emotional intelligence, curiosity, self-awareness, and creativity. Now, critics often point out that generative AI doesn't really give us signs of displaying these things. And I would say, well, neither do most humans. But we can and should, and that's the opportunity to future-proof ourselves. Secondly, it's really important, more important than ever, to develop deep expertise. AI is redefining the meaning of expertise, which has transitioned already from knowing the answers to questions to asking the right questions and being able to vet AI and call it out on its hallucinations or BS. So think of generative AI as the intellectual equivalent as fast food. It's quick, it's tasty, it's a rapid and sometimes not very nutritious but helpful fix for a hungry mind. But we need to ensure that we also develop the intellectual equivalent to the farm-to-table or slow food movement. And that's on us. It's about human creativity. And finally, I think it is helpful to refrain from having double standards. We often expect or demand perfection from AI, and AI is still a work in progress, while being totally fine with unacceptable human behavior. So one self-driving car crashes and we're quickly scandalized or horrified, but 1.3 million people die every year courtesy of human drivers, and we're okay with it. So the goal for AI is not instant perfection, but finding better ways of being wrong and making incremental improvements to the status quo, which, let's face it, is often not a very high bar. Thank you very much.